had been returned because of diplomatic pressure, not English generosity. Isabella herself had surprisingly little input into these discussions, despite the fact that they concerned her entire future. The terms eventually agreed upon were deliberately ambiguous, allowing both sides to interpret them according to their political needs. Isabella would return to France, but the exact circumstances of her departure would be left undefined. She would not be required to formally renounce her status as Richard's widow, but neither would the English government acknowledge any ongoing obligations to her. Most importantly for Henry, her departure would not include any admission that she had been held against her will. As preparations for her journey began, Isabella found herself experiencing complex emotions about leaving England. This country had been her home for nearly 6 years, longer than she had lived anywhere else. Despite the trauma of recent months, she had genuine affection for many of the people she was leaving behind. Margaret Holland, her childhood companion, came to say goodbye with tears streaming down her face. The two girls, now young women, embraced with the knowledge that they would likely never see each other again. Isabella's English tutors, the servants who had cared for her, even some of the guards who had protected her, all came to pay their respects to the young woman who had shown such grace under impossible circumstances. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was both liberation and exile. Isabella traveled in a convoy befitting her royal status, but she was acutely aware that each mile took her further from the life she had built in England. She spoke English better than French now, preferred English fashions to French ones, and had absorbed English customs and perspectives that would mark her as foreign in her father's court. The 6-year-old child who had left Paris was returning as an 11-year-old young woman, shaped by experiences that none of her French relatives could fully understand. The reunion with her family was emotional, but strained. Charles the Mad was in the midst of another episode when Isabella arrived, convinced that he was being pursued by invisible assassins and refusing to recognize his own daughter. When he finally emerged from his madness several weeks later, he seemed confused by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten that she had ever been married to the English king. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was more welcoming but also more calculating. She immediately began considering how Isabella's unique position might be used to advance French interests in the ongoing struggles with England and Burgundy. Isabella found herself caught between competing demands on her loyalty and knowledge. She was French by birth and had returned to French soil, but she had also been Queen of England and felt some lingering obligation to the country that had been her home. When her mother's advisors questioned her about English military capabilities or Henry's support among the nobility, she answered carefully, providing general information while avoiding details that might be used to plan military campaigns against people she had once considered friends and protectors. The French court of 1401 was a dangerous place for someone with Isabella's complex loyalties. The ongoing conflict with England meant that anti-English sentiment ran high among the nobility, and Isabella's years as Queen of England made some courtiers view her with suspicion. She had to be careful not to appear too sympathetic to English interests, while also not betraying the genuine affection she had felt for Richard and many of his supporters. At the same time, her father's mental instability meant that the French government was effectively controlled by competing factions of nobles, each seeking to advance their own interests at the expense of their rivals. The young woman, who had once been England's queen, found herself navigating an environment even more treacherous than Henry's court. At least in the Tower, her enemies had been obvious and her status clear. In France, she had to constantly prove her loyalty to a country that felt foreign to her, while avoiding being used as a pawn by various noble factions. Her experiences in England had taught her valuable lessons about survival in royal politics, but they had also marked her as someone whose allegiances could never be entirely trusted. Isabella's story during these months reveals the brutal realities faced by royal women in medieval Europe. She had been married as a child to secure peace between two kingdoms, but when that peace collapsed, she found herself blamed for its failure. She had been crowned Queen of England, but when the king fell, she became a prisoner. She had been returned to her birth country as a diplomatic necessity, but found herself viewed as a potential traitor because of her English experiences. Back in France, Isabella's fate hung in the balance, like a delicate thread stretched between warring kingdoms. The French court that welcomed her home was nothing like the stable haven she had known during her early years as Queen of England. This was a realm torn apart by her father's madness, her mother's desperate political maneuvering, and the constant threat of English invasion. At just 11 years old, Isabella had already experienced more political upheaval than most adults would face in a lifetime, but her greatest trials were yet to come. The negotiation for Isabella's release had been a masterclass in medieval diplomacy, with both sides carefully calculating the costs and benefits of every concession. Henry's government needed to rid themselves of a potential rallying point for Richard's supporters while maintaining some semblance of legitimacy in their treatment of foreign royalty. The French court, meanwhile, was eager to reclaim their princess, but also wary of appearing weak or desperate in their negotiations with the usurper king. The terms of Isabella's departure were deliberately ambiguous, allowing both sides to spin the narrative to their advantage. Henry could claim that he had graciously allowed the young widow to return to her family, demonstrating his magnanimity and respect for international relations. The French could argue that they had successfully demanded the return of their princess, showing strength in the face of English aggression. But for Isabella herself, the carefully crafted diplomatic language meant something far more personal and devastating. The acknowledgement that her marriage to Richard, her position as Queen of England, and her entire identity for the past 5 years had been reduced to political bargaining chips. The journey from the Tower of London to the French court was both a liberation and a form of exile. Isabella traveled with a small retinue of French attendants who had remained loyal to her throughout her captivity, but she was also accompanied by English officials whose job was to ensure that she actually left the country and didn't attempt to remain as a focal point for resistance to Henry's rule. The irony was not lost on Isabella that she was simultaneously being rescued and expelled, welcomed home, and banished from what had become her true home. As her ship crossed the Channel, Isabella must have reflected on the dramatic changes in her circumstances. 5 years earlier, she had made the same journey as a celebrated bride, the living symbol of peace between two great kingdoms. Now she was returning as a political refugee her marriage dissolved by force, her royal status questioned, and her future uncertain. The little girl who had been frightened by the grandeur of Westminster Abbey had been replaced by a young woman who understood all too well the brutal realities of medieval politics. The reunion with her family was complicated by the passage of time and the traumatic experiences that had shaped Isabella during her years in England. Her father, Charles the Mad, was in the midst of one of his worst episodes when she arrived, convinced that he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. The sight of her father cowering in the corner of his chamber, trembling at shadows and speaking to invisible enemies, was a stark reminder of the instability that had always characterized her homeland.